He was an illustrious ally, the father-in-law of Europe, a king who sacrificed his entire army and glory to save his friends. Yet he was branded a traitor by the very people he saved. He was stripped of his throne, his ancient kingdom wiped off the map, and he died in poverty and misery and exile, buried in an unfamiliar grave for 68 years. His name was King Nicholas I of Montenegro. How could lifelong loyalty be rewarded with final, complete, and devastating betrayal? To truly understand the nature of Nicholas I, we must first immerse ourselves in the harsh, savage world that shaped him. This is not a story of a king born into gilded palaces and ancient, undisputed power. No, Nicholas emerged from the very harshness of existence, from a land that was less a nation in the European sense than a resilient fortress carved into the Balkan rock itself. This was Montenegro in the mid-19th century, a kingdom unlike any other, defined by a majestic landscape and an even more tragic history. Imagine for a moment stripping away the comforts of modern life. Forget the orderly streets, rolling hills, or predictable seasons of Western Europe. Instead, picture a panorama of rugged, jagged peaks, often shrouded in the dark, ominous mist that gives the name Montenegro, Black Mountain. Here the roads are little more than goat trails, clinging to the cliffs above deep gorges. Life is harsh, cruel, and built on a foundation of unshakable resilience. This is a land where every dawn brings its own test of survival, where the very act of making a living is a testament to one's will. For 5 centuries, as empires rose and fell around them, as Venice prospered and the Ottoman tide swept across the continent, this small group of Orthodox Slavs stood firm. They were an unyielding island in the vast Ottoman Sea, never fully conquered, never truly assimilated. Their independence was not granted. It was imposed violently, brutally, and repeatedly fought for. This constant struggle defined their society. It was not a land of massive bureaucracies or sophisticated economies. It was a land of warriors, poets, and shepherds. Loyalty was paramount, pledged not to an abstract state, but to the clan, the church, and the ruling dynasty that embodied their collective spirit. Nikola Petrovich Njegoš was born in 1841 into this harsh, heroic, and traditional world. The village was in Njeguši, a cluster of stone houses perched precariously on the mountain, a place that even then seemed ancient and timeless. He was no ordinary child. He was born into the Petrovich Njegoš dynasty, a family that for generations had been the heart and soul of the Montenegrin resistance. It was a unique lineage, combining princely power with religious power. His ancestors were vladikas, the prince-bishops. They were both spiritual leaders, guiding their people with orthodox piety, and military commanders, leading them in battle against adversity. It was a dual role, both pragmatic and deeply symbolic, that perfectly embodied the Montenegrin spirit. Faith intertwined with a steadfast will to freedom. But even in Njeguši, the winds of change were blowing. The mid-19th century was a time of profound transformation across Europe. Old empires were collapsing, new national identities were forming, and the idea of a modern secular state was gaining traction. Nicholas's uncle, Danilo I, who ascended the throne just a few years before Nicholas was born, realized that Montenegro could not remain frozen in time. He understood that survival in the modern world required modernization, and for Danilo, modernization meant a complete abandonment of centuries-old traditions. Danilo was a man of courage and vision. He was the first ruler of the Petrovich Njegoš family to separate church and state, actively abandoning the ancient title of bishop to become Prince Danilo I. This was a monumental move, signaling his intention to transform Montenegro from a theocratic military principality into a more secular, mainstream European state. His reforms were bold, sometimes brutal, and always met with fierce resistance from conservative tribal leaders. He introduced a new code of laws, attempting to curb the feuds that plagued Montenegrin society. He tried to centralize power, collect taxes more efficiently, and build the rudiments of a state: a few rough roads, a handful of schools. In essence, he was trying to drag a medieval society deeply rooted in ancient customs and tribal loyalties into the complex realities of the 19th century. This work, as you can imagine, was fraught with danger. For many, reforming deeply ingrained traditions was an act of betrayal. Nicholas, the grandson of the reigning prince, was destined to follow a different path from his warrior ancestors. Not only did he grow up amid the austere grandeur of Cetinje, the small capital deep in the valley, but he also saw the need for a refined, internationally minded leader. Prince Danilo made a crucial decision. Young Nicola would be sent abroad to study. His journey began in Trieste, a bustling port city, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A world away from Jagushi there, he was exposed to a more cosmopolitan environment, exposed to European culture and scholarship. But his real transformation came when he was sent to Paris, the intellectual and cultural center of Europe. He attended the prestigious Lycée Louis le Grand, a school that had educated figures such as Voltaire and Robespierre. Imagine the contrast: a boy from the rugged mountains of Montenegro now entering the meticulously manicured halls of a Paris lycée studying French, Latin, mathematics, and philosophy. He was exposed to the sons of Europe's elite, imbued with the ideas of nationalism and state-building that were sweeping the continent. And, more importantly, he saw firsthand what a modern European nation looked like: its institutions, its society, its complex diplomatic dance. He was well trained not just to lead, but to transform, to bridge the vast gap between his ancient homeland and the rapidly developing world. This period was a formative one. Nicholas developed a keen intellect, a strategic mind, and a respect for culture and learning. He was an avid reader, studied military strategy, and honed his diplomatic skills. He was a striking-looking young man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the proud, piercing eyes of his lineage. But beneath his warrior exterior lay a keen intellect, natural charisma, and cultivated sensitivity. In essence, he was the perfect blend of old and new, a Montenegrin warrior poet trained in Paris, ready to navigate the complex currents of European power politics. Then, in August 1860, his world and the future of Montenegro were changed violently and irrevocably. Prince Danilo, after years of internal dissent and external threats, was en route to visit the then Austrian-controlled Bay of Kotor. As he prepared to board a ship, he was approached by a Montenegrin named Todor Kadic, who harbored a deep personal grudge against the prince, possibly stemming from a land dispute or perceived injustice. Kadic, a member of a family that felt marginalized by Danilo's reforms, pulled out a pistol and shot the prince. Danilo died of his wounds shortly thereafter. The news, grim and swift, reached Nicholas in Paris. He had just turned 18. His idyllic student days, his intellectual pursuits, his youthful adventures in the cafes of the Latin Quarter, all had vanished in an instant. The carefree life of a foreign student was over. Fate, in the form of an assassin's bullet, had called him home. He hurried back to Montenegro, no longer a grieving nephew, but a new, untested king of a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. At 18, Prince Nicholas I ascended the throne, a throne not only inherited, but also wrested from his enemies. The task before him was terrifyingly clear but fraught with danger. He had to avenge his uncle's assassination, consolidate his fragile power among rival families and ambitious warlords, and somehow navigate the treacherous waters of the great game, the relentless struggle for influence between the giant European powers, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the crumbling Ottoman Empire, all of whom regarded his tiny principality as nothing more than a pawn on their grand chessboard. His first reign was, to put it mildly, a trial by fire. The Ottoman Empire, always wary of weakness, seized the opportunity. They launched a series of aggressive invasions along Montenegro's borders, testing the resolve of the new young Prince Nicholas, fresh from his Parisian salon, was immediately thrust into the field. He had to prove not only to his foreign enemies, but more importantly, to his own grizzled clan leaders, men decades his senior, seasoned in war, that this young French-speaking man was a true Petrovich Ngegos, that he possessed heroism, the heroic courage of his ancestors, that he was a combatant. And he met the challenge with astonishing bravery. He led his army from the front lines into battle, his imposing figure a fulcrum for his men. He did more than command. He inspired. Through a series of fierce battles and tenacious campaigns, he defeated the Ottomans, regained lost territory, and, more importantly, earned the deep, abiding respect of his people. These early victories were crucial. They legitimized his authority in the eyes of his fierce, independent people and proved his military prowess to skeptical European powers. But Nicholas, with his Parisian education, understood that military victory, while essential, was not enough for long-term survival. Montenegro was poor, its economy primitive, based largely on subsistence agriculture and livestock. It was a land of shepherds and soldiers, with little industry or modern infrastructure. To survive in the brutal landscape of 19th century Europe, Montenegro needed more than a fighting spirit. It needed international recognition, a stable government, and a path to economic development. Montenegro needed to be seen as a reality country, not just a rebellious province. He immediately embarked on a dizzying reform drive that demonstrated an extraordinary combination of traditional authority and modern vision. He understood that a truly sovereign state needed strong institutions. He focused on education, establishing the first secondary school in Cetinje, a huge step forward for a country with widespread illiteracy. He established a state printing press and launched Montenegro's first newspaper, Glas Crnogorka, Voice of Montenegro, using it as a tool to promote national unity and disseminate information. He reorganized the army, aiming to transform it from a collection of tribal militias, largely loyal to the chiefs, into a more disciplined, centrally controlled fighting force, loyal to the prince. He was a dynamic man, a young man in a hurry, driven by an almost messianic zeal to build a modern state from scratch. And just a few months after his accession in November 1860, he made a decision that, while rooted in ancient custom, was one of the most important in his political and personal life. He married Milena Vukotic. At the time of their marriage, she was only 13 years old. This was not a Parisian romance, nor a marriage in the Western sense. It was a typical Balkan political alliance. Milena was the daughter of Petar Vukotic, one of Montenegro's most powerful figures, the governor's commander, and a key ally from the north of the country. The marriage was a masterstroke, a brilliant strategic move to unite two of Montenegro's most influential families, thereby consolidating Nicholas's power, strengthening his influence within, and neutralizing the persistent threat of internal rivalries and family disputes that had plagued his uncle's reign. Despite its arranged nature and Milena's youth, the relationship proved to be a long-lasting, stable, and surprisingly successful one. Empress Milena, a strong-willed and deeply religious woman, became the mother of the Petrovich-Njegoš dynasty, providing Nicholas with unwavering support and a large family. Together they had 12 children, 3 sons and 9 daughters. Little did anyone know at the time that these daughters would become Nicholas's most effective diplomatic weapon, allowing him to elevate his small, impoverished nation to the foundation of European royalty. With his domestic base secured and initial military challenges overcome, Nicholas consolidated his power in Montenegro. He was no longer just a young, inexperienced prince. He had become God, a recognized leader, respected both at home and increasingly abroad. Now the time has come to step into a much bigger, more dangerous game on the European stage. From his uncle's struggles and his early experiences, he has learned that mere survival is not enough to truly secure Montenegro's future. He will need to navigate the treacherous political currents of the great powers, and he will do so with a combination of bold ambition, shrewd calculation, and unexpected charisma. The stage has been set for the astonishing transformation of Montenegro and its prince into an illustrious kingdom. For the next 50 years, from 1860 to 1910, Prince Nicholas I performed one of the most skillful and precarious balancing acts in European history. His entire reign, this long half-century, could be defined by a single, ultimate goal: survival. Not just his own survival as a ruler, but the survival of Montenegro as a concept, as an independent entity in a region where empires clashed, and small states were the currency of their bargaining chips. By every 19th century definition, he was a dictator. Make no mistake about it. He was not a constitutional monarch in the British sense, nor was he a republican. He was an absolute ruler, a patriarch in the deepest sense of the word. He famously and succinctly summarized his political philosophy: I am the sole motive force of this state. And in fact, he was the executive, the chief legislator, and the supreme judge. His small group of loyal advisors and ministers were there to carry out his will, not to challenge it, but to label him just one as a dictator. He would miss the nuance of his rule, a characteristic Montenegrin quality. He is not a distant, isolated tyrant in the Russian czarist style, hiding behind palace walls. Instead, he is a genuine populist, a god, a title that could be roughly translated as master or lord, but which carried a deeper, more intimate, and much more ancient meaning than prince. Deep down, he understood that his power came not just from God or from his dynasty. It came from the approval of the Montenegrin people, from the very tribal chieftains he was trying to control. He cultivated this popular bond with meticulous care. One of his most famous acts was holding public hearings in Cetinje. He would sit under a large spreading plane tree, and any Montenegrin, from the poorest shepherd to the most powerful tribal chief, could approach him directly. They would come to petition him, to express their grievances, to settle disputes. This was more than a photo opportunity. It was the core function of his government. He would listen patiently for hours, his remarkable memory on full display. He knew their family lineage, their clan history, their past feuds. He would administer justice, offer advice, or promise support, not as a faceless official, but as the supreme head of their extended national family. This activity cemented his image as a father of the people, approachable and deeply invested in their lives. He also nurtured this bond through culture. Nicholas was a man of genuine literary talent. He was a poet, and his writing was not the idle pastime of the nobility. He wrote epic poems that celebrated Montenegrin history, its heroes, and its endless struggles against the Ottomans. His most famous work, The Queen of the Balkans, Balkanska Karika, became a phenomenon. These poems were memorized, recited in homes, and taught in the very schools he founded. He did not merely rule his people, he actively wrote the national narrative, seeing himself as the inheritor and protagonist of a centuries-long heroic struggle. But while he cultivated the inner image of a traditional patriarch, his true genius was revealed on the vast and perilous chessboard of European foreign policy. His small, impoverished kingdom was trapped geographically. To the east, and most importantly, he had his great protector, the mighty Orthodox Russian Empire. The czars in St. Petersburg viewed the Montenegrins, their fellow Slavs and co-religionists, with a paternal romantic affection. They were the Little Brothers, Malenkaya Brasha, a brave, pure Slavic outpost in the Ottoman-dominated Balkans. This relationship was Montenegro's lifeblood. Russia provided regular, massive aid in the form of money, grain, modern rifles, and ammunition. Without this constant flow of aid, Montenegro, with its barren, rocky soil and lack of industry, would simply starve or be overwhelmed militarily. Nicholas cultivated this relationship with boundless devotion. He made many trips to St. Petersburg, claiming to be the Tsar's most loyal servant, and ensuring that loyalty to Russia was an almost religious duty in Montenegro itself. To the north and west, however, a much closer and more dangerous presence loomed: the vast, sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. Vienna was his nearest and most powerful neighbor. The Austrians viewed Montenegro with deep suspicion. They desperately wanted control of the Balkans, especially the Adriatic coast, and saw Montenegrin and Serbian nationalism as a direct threat to the stability of their multi-ethnic empire. Austria controlled the Bay of Kotor, the region's major natural harbor, effectively blocking Montenegro from the sea and controlling its meager trade. Nicholas's relationship with Vienna was a masterpiece of diplomatic deception. He played games with the Habsburgs, sometimes cooperating with them to win small concessions, sometimes provoking them, all the while keeping them guessing about his true intentions, which were always pro-Russian. And finally, in the south, his eternal enemy, the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-19th century, the patient of Europe was in steady decline. Nicholas's primary strategic goal, beyond mere survival, was to conquer Ottoman territory. He wanted to expand Montenegro's borders, liberate the Slavic lands still under Turkish rule, and, most importantly, achieve his lifelong obsession, securing a seaport, an outlet to the Adriatic Sea. His first major opportunity to demonstrate his talents on all these fronts, military, domestic, and diplomatic, came in the 1870s. The Balkans were a powder keg. In 1875, a major uprising against Ottoman rule broke out in neighboring Herzegovina. The Christian community, taxed to starvation and brutally oppressed, rose up in desperate rebellion. The flames of rebellion quickly spread. Nicholas, seeing his opportunity and spurred on by the people's desire to help their Slavic brethren, declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1876. In a full alliance with neighboring Serbia, the war was brutal, a tug-of-war waged with characteristic Montenegrin tenacity. Nicholas, once again at the helm, cemented his reputation as a warrior prince. The small Montenegrin army won a series of resounding victories, most notably the Battle of Vucci Du. But the Ottomans, with their vast reserves of manpower, finally threw their weight behind them, pushing back the Serbs and threatening to overwhelm Montenegro. Just when disaster seemed imminent, Montenegro's great protector intervened. In 1877, Tsar Alexander II of Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Turkish War was a disaster for the Ottomans. The Russian army smashed through their defenses and reached the gates of Constantinople. When the dust settled, the European powers met in Germany to redraw the map of the Balkans. This was the Congress of Berlin in 1878. For Prince Nicholas, it was the greatest triumph of his life. He arrived in Berlin not as a lord from a rebellious province, but as a recognized European statesman. And he left with everything he had ever dreamed of, first and foremost. The Treaty of Berlin formally recognized Montenegro, because the great powers, as a fully independent and sovereign state gone, are the centuries of its ambiguous existence, technically as an Ottoman vassal or a Russian protectorate. In terms of international law, Montenegro is on a par with France, Britain, or Germany second. His territory was doubled. He acquired significant new lands, including the towns of Nikšić, Podgorica, which later became the economic capital, and Kološin. And third, he finally achieved his great ambition, access to the sea. Montenegro was granted a small but important stretch of the Adriatic coast, including the port of Bar Prince Nicholas I, the 18-year-old heir to a quasi-medieval mountain fortress. Spent 18 years of cunning diplomacy and warfare, transforming it into a recognized independent European state. He returned to Cetinje as a national hero, with prestige and absolute power. But he knew that recognition was fragile. He knew that treaties signed by the great powers could be broken. To truly protect his dynasty and his nation, he needed to tie himself to the very structure of European power. He needed to bring Montenegro into the old royal network. His army was small, his economy weak, but he had a new, powerful, and very personal resource: his children. Nicholas and Empress Milena, in their modest palace at Cetinje, presided over a warm and vibrant household. Nicholas, with the keen eye of a seasoned strategist, initiated a dynastic marriage campaign so successful that it earned him his most famous nickname, the father-in-law of Europe. He didn't just target any royal family, he targeted the most important families, playing a long-term strategic game. His first major move was to strengthen relations with his most important neighbor, Serbia. The two countries were brother nations, both South Slavic and Orthodox, but their ruling dynasties were rivals. Nicholas found an excellent match. His eldest daughter, Princess Zorka, married Peter Karađorđević, the exiled claimant to the Serbian throne. At the time, Peter was a penniless exile, but Nicholas bet on the future. It was a good gamble. In 1903, a bloody coup in Belgrade crowned Peter as King Peter I. Of Serbia, Nicholas's daughter was now Queen of Serbia, although she had died in childbirth a few years earlier, and his grandchildren were in the direct line of succession. This linked two great Serbian dynasties, a move Nicholas hoped might one day lead to a unified Serbian state under his family's influence. Then he made a spectacular and most important move, striking at the very heart of his great protector, Russia. He sent his two daughters, Princess Milica and Princess Anastasia, known as Stana, to be educated at the prestigious Smolny Academy for noble girls in St. Petersburg under the patronage of the Tsar himself. They were celebrities, beautiful, charming, and supremely intelligent. They conquered the Russian court. They married into the imperial family itself, Milica to Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich and Anastasia to Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, known as Nikolasha, one of Russia's most powerful military generals. Both were cousins of Tsar Nicholas II. These black princesses, as the Russian court called them, became incredibly powerful. They were deeply mystical, steeped in spiritualism and occultism, and they built a powerful circle of influence around Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. It was Milica and Stana who, in 1905, first introduced a charismatic wandering saint from Siberia to the imperial court. His name was Grigory Rasputin. This single appearance, born of a Montenegrin royal marriage, had world-changing consequences, contributing to the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. For Nicholas of Montenegro, however, it had a much more urgent meaning. He had a direct personal blood relationship with the Russian Tsar. When he needed something from Russia, he didn't just send an ambassador. He also had his daughters whisper it into the imperial family's ear. But Nicholas wasn't done yet. He had strengthened his flank with Serbia and allied with Russia. Now he set his sights on one of the great ancient thrones of Western Europe. In 1896, in a match that shook the continent, his daughter, Princess Elena, married Victor Emmanuel, Prince of Naples and sole heir to the Italian throne. When Victor Emmanuel's father was assassinated in 1900, he ascended the throne as King Victor Emmanuel III, and Nicholas's daughter, a girl from the small impoverished capital of Cetinje, became Queen Elena of Italy. It was an astonishing achievement. The son of a mountain chieftain was now the father of a queen who ruled a great power. He had married his other daughters to German and Russian nobility, Princess Anna to Prince Franz Joseph of Battenberg, and Princess Zorka's son Alexander would one day become king of the newly created Yugoslavia. Nicholas had woven his small, impoverished nation into the very DNA of European royalty. He was no longer just a small Balkan prince. He was a head of household of European royalty, a respected and well-connected king. By 1910, Nicholas was 69. He had reigned for half a century. He had transformed a fragmented, isolated, semi-independent territory into a fully sovereign, internationally recognized state with a growing economy, modern laws, and a royal family with connections to some of the world's greatest families. He even promulgated a constitution in 1905, undoubtedly under enormous popular and international pressure, but it was another sign of a modern state. He decided it was time to mark this achievement, to crown the final chapter of his life's work. On August 28, 1910, to celebrate 50 years on the throne, he issued a momentous proclamation Montenegro was no longer a mere principality. Now, by the grace of God and the will of the people, it had become a kingdom, and he, Prince Nicholas I, is now His Majesty, King Nicholas I of Montenegro. The coronation in Cetinje was the ultimate culmination of his power and prestige. The small capital was filled with royalty and dignitaries from all over Europe. The King of Italy was there, as was the King of Bulgaria. Grand dukes came from Russia, representing the Tsar, princes from Germany, Austria, and Greece. Representatives from England, France, and the United States filled the town. It was the final public recognition of all he had worked for. He had put Montenegro on the map, not as a footnote, but as a recognized kingdom, with himself as its anointed king. But this great victory was taking place on the brink of a volcano. The glamorous, cohesive world of European royalty into which he had married his daughter was far more fragile than it appeared. The Balkans, which he had helped to reshape, was a powder keg of seething nationalism and rival ambitions. His neighbors, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, dreamed of expansion, as did he. All looked south to the last remaining Ottoman territories in Europe, Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, and saw their destiny. In 1912, just 2 years after his accession to the throne, King Nicholas, in a final fit of ambition, joined forces with his Balkan neighbors to form a military alliance. The Balkan League, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The First Balkan War was a stunning, swift, and decisive victory. In just a few weeks, the Allied armies shattered Ottoman power in Europe, a power that had dominated the region for 500 years. The Montenegrin army, led by Nicholas's son, Crown Prince Danilo, marched south and laid siege to the great strategic fortress city of Scutari, or Shkodra. The siege became a source of intense, almost fanatical national pride for Montenegro, but it also exposed a fatal flaw in Nicholas's character. His stubbornness, his belief that his will, which had served him so well for 50 years, could challenge the new realities of European power. The great powers, especially Austria-Hungary, were horrified by the success of the Balkan League, and they were absolutely adamant about one thing: Montenegro would, or not were allowed to retain Scutari. They had their own plans for the region, including the creation of a new buffer state called Albania, with Scutari as the planned capital. They issued a blunt warning to Nicholas: back off. When he refused, they organized a naval blockade along the Montenegrin coast. His allies, Serbia and Greece, having achieved their objectives, yielded to pressure from the great powers and withdrew. But Nicholas, spurred on by the patriotic fervor of his people and the blood his troops had shed on the battlefield, refused. He defied all of Europe. In April 1913, after a long and costly siege, his troops finally stormed the city. It was a moment of resounding victory, but a hollow, disastrous one. The bells of celebration in Cetinje were still ringing when the ultimatum from the great powers arrived. It was simple: withdraw from Scutari, or face a full-scale Austrian invasion. King Nicholas, proud, humiliated, and seething with rage, was forced to surrender. He had to hand over the city, bought with so much Montenegrin blood, to an international power. He had won new territory in the war, greatly expanding his kingdom. But he had also shown his limitations. He had alienated his allies, who saw him as reckless. He had angered Austria-Hungary, who now regarded him as a dangerous and unreliable rogue. And he had shown the powers that he was, in the end, a castaway. He was king of Montenegro, at the height of his power. But he had made powerful and uncompromising enemies, and the intricate dynastic alliances that held Europe together, the very web he had so painstakingly woven, were about to crumble one by one. The glittering, glittering world he had so confidently entered was about to collapse in a flood of steel and fire, and this time it would swallow him, his family, and his entire kingdom. The year was 1914. The glamorous, glittering world of pre-war Europe, a world that Tsar Nicholas had masterfully navigated, was built on dynamite. And in June of that year, in the city of Sarajevo, just north of Montenegro's border, the fuse was lit. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very empire that had deposed Nicholas over the Scutari affair, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb, a member of a nationalist group that dreamed of a unified South Slav state free from Austrian rule. Austria-Hungary, desperate for an excuse to finally crush its troublesome neighbor, issued Serbia an impossible ultimatum. Serbia, in a deft display of diplomacy, accepted most of the points, but rejected the crucial point that could have destroyed its sovereignty. But that was not enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on the Kingdom of Serbia. The great dominoes held in place by the complex web of alliances of which Nicholas himself was a part began to fall. Russia, Serbia's great protector, began to mobilize its mighty army. Germany, allied with Austria, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, declared war on Germany. Within a week, the continent was engulfed in what would become known as the Great War. For King Nicholas of Cetinje, there was no real choice. There was no debate, no agonizing calculations about a neutral path. The fate of his kingdom was decided. His entire foreign policy, His very existence was built on alliance with Russia. To abandon Russia would be to commit national suicide, to be left at the mercy of Austria at any moment. But this was more than cold political calculation. It was deeply personal. This was a war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had thwarted his ambitions, blockaded his coasts, and taken away his hard-won prize of Scutari. This was a war to protect his brother, nation Serbia. And it was a war to protect his own family. His beloved eldest daughter, Zorka, had been the wife of King Peter I of Serbia. His grandchildren were Serbian royalty. His son-in-law, the ailing King Peter, was now under attack. On August 6, 1914, just days after the conflict began, the tiny kingdom of Montenegro did the unthinkable. It declared war on the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was an act of incredible courage, a David hurling a stone at Goliath. But in retrospect, it was also an act of loyalty to the point of suicide. The Montenegrin army was a mirror image of its people. It was small, numbering only 40,000 to 50,000 at its peak. By 1914 standards, it was poorly equipped. They were not soldiers in the modern industrial sense. They were fearless warriors. They were experienced mountaineers, sharpshooters, and masters of the very type of warfare that would cripple the Western Front, guerrilla warfare. They had no heavy artillery, no air force, and very few machine guns. What they did have was a deep knowledge of the rugged terrain and a fierce fighting spirit that had endured for centuries. Their role in the war was clear and essential. They had to defend their borders and, most importantly, protect the western flank of the Serbian army, where their forces were deployed. In the first year of the war, they performed wonders. The Austrians, hoping to defeat the bandits from Cetinje, were faced with an iron wall. The Montenegrins, under Serdar, equivalent to Field Marshal Janko Vukotic, launched a daring attack on Austrian-held territory, even briefly occupying parts of Bosnia. They repelled several Austrian invasions of their own homeland, holding strongholds in the mountains against superior numbers and artillery. In short, they were a thorn in the side of the Habsburg Empire, tying down tens of thousands of enemy troops who were desperately needed on other fronts. But it came at a high price. The Allied naval blockade of Austria also cut off Montenegro from all its supplies. The country, barely self-sufficient in peacetime, began to starve. There was no food, no medicine, no ammunition, no winter clothing. Their only source of supply was Serbia, which was also under siege. By the winter of 1915, Montenegrin troops were exhausted, cold and hungry, but they fought on. It was then that the entire strategic situation in the Balkans collapsed. In October 1915, the Central Powers launched a devastating coordinated attack that would finally destroy Serbia. A massive German and Austro-Hungarian army, commanded by the brilliant German general August von Mackensen, swept across the Danube from the north. At the same time, Bulgaria, seeing an opportunity to regain territory lost in the Second Balkan War, declared war on Serbia and invaded from the east. The Serbian army, attacked from two directions at once, was utterly shattered. Caught in a pincer movement facing total annihilation, the Serbs had only one desperate and impossible choice: retreat. But they could not retreat north, east, or south. Their only escape was west, through the icy, inhospitable mountains of Montenegro and Albania to the Adriatic coast, where they hoped the Allied navies would await what followed was one of the most traumatic episodes of World War I, an event seared into Serb memory as the Golgotha of Albania. The entire Serbian army, 250,000 hungry, cold, typhus-stricken soldiers, began a desperate evacuation. With them were tens of thousands of civilians, and their ailing 67-year-old king, Peter I, Nicholas's son-in-law, who was so ill he had to be carried on a stretcher. This was not a retreat, it was a death march. They trudged through the passes in the freezing winter without food, shelter, or medicine. They were hunted by Albanian tribes. Tens of thousands froze to death. Horses were eaten. Men, maddened with hunger, lay in the snow and died. As this ghoulish army of skeletons staggered through Montenegro, the Austro-Hungarian army advanced in hot pursuit, eager to capture and destroy them once and for all. The Montenegrin army itself, on the brink of collapse, was given one final impossible order: hold the line. They would be the rear guard. They were to halt the advancing Austrians long enough for the remaining Serbian army and the king to escape. What followed was Montenegro's greatest moment. It was also their last. On January 6, 1916, Christmas Eve, according to the Orthodox calendar, the main Austrian attack fell on Montenegrin positions near the town of Mojkovac. The Montenegrin Sanjak army, led by the indomitable Janko Vukotic, dug in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, hungry, and cold, many of them without boots, their rifles older than the men who fired them. Facing them were the healthy, well-fed, and heavily armed divisions of the Austrian Empire. For 2 days, under blinding snowstorms and brutal sub-zero temperatures, the Montenegrins fought one of the most fierce and desperate battles of the war. It was a battle of bayonets and handheld bombs fought in close quarters in snow-covered trenches. The Austrians charged again and again, and the Montenegrins, chanting ancient battle cries, pushed the Austrians back. They knew exactly what they were fighting for. As Serdar Vukotic told his men, "If we fail, we lose our honor. If we succeed, we will save the Serbian army and our honor." They had succeeded. They had held the line. The Battle of Mojkovac was a stunning tactical victory for Montenegro. They had stopped an army many times their own size, but it was a strategic sacrifice. They had exhausted the last of their strength. After rescuing the Serbian army, which would be evacuated by Allied ships from the Albanian coast, regrouped, and then returned to fight victoriously on the Salonika front, the Montenegrin army was broken. It was left with nothing. The Austrian army, already stopped, now only needed to regroup and flood the country from 3 directions. The kingdom, its defenses exhausted, was now defenseless. The road to the capital, Cetinje, was clear. And here, in the cold, dark days of January 1916, King Nicholas I, now 74 years old, made the most controversial and fateful decision of his life. As the Austrian army approached the capital, the king, Queen Milena, the government, and the court decided to flee. They argued that the army should surrender to spare the civilians a hopeless, bloody, and final massacre. The king's sons, Prince Danilo and Prince Peter, remained with the army, but Nicholas himself would not be captured. They fled across the border into Albania, which was also in turmoil. They made their way to the coast, where an Italian ship, sent by his daughter, Queen Elena of Italy, was waiting. On January 19, 1916, King Nicholas I, god of the Black Mountains, stepped off Montenegrin soil and onto the deck of a ship. Now he was a king in exile. He will never see his kingdom again. The criticism came immediately, deeply, and brutally. And the loudest criticism came not from his enemies, but from his allies. His detractors, especially powerful figures in the Serbian government in exile, which had established a base on the Greek island of Corfu, immediately and systematically began to cast this as the ultimate betrayal. They called him a coward, a traitor. They claimed he had abandoned his people, that he had fled to save himself while his army was ordered to surrender. Dark, insidious rumors circulated that Nicholas had signed a secret, treacherous agreement with the Austrians, that he had negotiated a separate peace, to save his throne and dynasty at the expense of the Allied cause. The truth, as always, is much more complicated and much more tragic. In Nicholas's view, his decision was not an act of cowardice, but a widely accepted royal practice in a total war. He saw himself as the living, breathing embodiment of the Montenegrin state. In the authoritarian mindset of the 19th century, as long as he, the king, was free, the kingdom would survive, even if the territory were occupied. He argued that his capture would mean the legal and moral end of Montenegro. His freedom meant the survival of the state. In fact, he did exactly what other Allied monarchs had done. King Albert I of Belgium did not surrender in 1914. He withdrew his army to a small pocket of Belgian territory and continued to fight. His son-in-law, King Peter I of Serbia, had just been evacuated from Albania and was now safe in Greece. Nicholas did not surrender. In fact, he was moving the government. He fully intended to continue the war from Allied territory. He traveled from Italy to France, where the French government, with some reluctance, granted him and his government in exile a base, first in Bordeaux and then in the wealthy suburbs of Paris. He began issuing proclamations, appointing new ministers, and preparing to represent his country's interests. He was fully confident that when the Allies inevitably won the war, he would return to Cetinje in triumph, his loyalty rewarded, his kingdom restored, and perhaps even enlarged. He had no way of knowing that he had just walked into a political trap from which he would never escape. He had no way of knowing that his greatest allies were plotting to sabotage his politics. He quickly found himself in a political nightmare, isolated in France. He was a king without a country, without an army, and he was horrified to discover with almost no political influence. His most important relationship, that with Serbia, not only worsened but also worsened. The Serbian government in exile, led by the brilliant, cunning, and ruthless Prime Minister Nikolaj Pašić, had a grand new vision for the post-war world. The war had changed everything. Their goal was no longer simply a greater Serbia. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 and America's entry into the war meant that President Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination became paramount. Pašić used this language deftly. He was no longer fighting for Serbia. He was fighting for Yugoslavia, a single unified kingdom, all South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And in this new, powerful, and unified Yugoslav state, there was simply no place for a separate and independent kingdom of Montenegro. More importantly, there was absolutely no room for the proud, stubborn, and ambitious king Nicholas I, who had on Nicholas dreamed of leading the South Slavs. Nicholas was more than just a king and ally. He was now a dynasty, a competitor with the Karađorđević dynasty of Serbia. He was an obstacle to Pašić's grand vision. And Pašić, a skilled political operator, knew exactly how to remove an obstacle. While King Nicholas, isolated in France, wrote desperate letters to Allied leaders without receiving a response, a much more insidious war was being waged against him. Serbian spies, well-funded, were at work. Inside occupied Montenegro, they spread propaganda that Nicholas was a traitor who had abandoned his people. They promised the war-torn population that their only future, their only salvation, lay in unification with their powerful and victorious brothers in Serbia. At the same time, in the corridors of power in Paris, London, and Washington, Serbian diplomats and their supporters quietly and effectively portrayed Nicholas as unreliable, autocratic, and treacherous. They presented themselves as the sole and legitimate voice of all South Slavs, including Montenegrins. The man whose army had just died at Mokovac to save the Serbian army was now being systematically and clinically destroyed by the very government he had saved. Nicholas thought his enemy was in Vienna. He was wrong. His real and far more dangerous enemy was his allies on the island of Corfu. The tragedy was no longer a military tragedy. It had become a political assassination. By the autumn of 1918, the tide of the Great War had changed decisively and irreversibly. The Central Powers were collapsing. On the long stagnant Salonika front in northern Greece, a reformed and re-equipped Serbian army, burning with the desire to regain its homeland, joined a massive Allied offensive. It broke through the Bulgarian lines, forcing Bulgaria to surrender. The Ottoman Empire followed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, hollowed out by years of war and internal dissension, was falling apart. The war is over. Victory is near. For King Nicholas, living in seclusion at his villa in Neuilly-sur-Seine, near Paris, this should have been a moment of vindication. It was exactly what he had been waiting for. His sacrifice, his loyalty to the Allies, the sacrifice of his troops at Mokovac, it was all about to pay off. He had been preparing his government in exile for a triumphant return to Cetinje to rebuild a devastated, starving country. But as the victorious Allies and Serbians pushed north, a cold new reality began to emerge. When Serbian troops, along with French units, crossed the border into Montenegro, they did not come as mere liberators visiting an ally. They came as an occupying force with a fixed political agenda. The Serbian government of Nikola Pasic had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. They had no intention of allowing King Nicholas to return, nor did they have any intention of restoring an independent Montenegro. Their goal was annexation, and they were prepared to use all their military might, along with the political cover of powerful allies, to achieve it. What took place in Montenegro in the final months of 1918 was not a liberation, but a swift and extremely brutal political coup. Serbian troops fanned out across the country, disarming the remnants of the local Montenegrin militia. They took control of all government buildings, post offices, and telegraph stations. Those loyal to King Nicholas, judges, mayors, and police chiefs, were dismissed, arrested, or forced into hiding. The country was placed under martial law, run by Serbian military commanders. The message was clear and devastating. The era of the Petrović-Njegoš dynasty was over. The era of Montenegro's independence was over. But Pasic, a master of political theater, knew that a blatant military conquest would make a bad impression at the upcoming Paris Peace Conference. He needed to appeal to the great powers, especially American President Woodrow Wilson, an idealist appearance of self-determination. He needed to stage an event to prove that the Montenegrin people selecto joined Serbia. This event would become known as the Council of Podgorica. To this day, it remains one of the most controversial and painful moments in Balkan history. In November 1918, the call for elections for a great national assembly was made in Podgorica, a larger pro-Serbian trading town, rather than the royal capital Cetinje, which was strongly loyal to the king. This was not an election in any recognizable democratic sense. The country was under foreign military occupation. The press was censored. Any pro-king political activity was banned. Voters were often handpicked by the Serbian government. In many areas, armed Serbian troops simply endorsed the local pro-federation candidate. Those who opposed were threatened, beaten, or imprisoned. This was an act of political intimidation designed to produce a single, predetermined outcome. The group of delegates so elected gathered in Podgorica on the 24th of November, 1918. The conference hall was surrounded by Serbian soldiers. The delegates were divided into two main factions. Named after the color of their political ballot, the whites were the Unionists, funded and organized by Belgrade, who advocated the complete and unconditional annexation of Montenegro to Serbia. The Greens were the monarchists, supporters of King Nicholas and an independent Montenegro, who were now a hunted, feared, and outnumbered minority. On the 26th of November 1918, the General Assembly convened for its final, decisive vote. There was no debate. There was no discussion. A resolution prepared in Belgrade was read to the entire assembly. With a simple show of hands, the General Assembly, surrounded by armed soldiers, declared the resolution prepared in Belgrade was read and passed by a show of hands. The resolution stated, the first, King Nicholas I, Petrovich Njegoš and his entire dynasty were to be deposed from the Montenegrin throne. Next, with this deposition, the kingdom of Montenegro would be unconditionally annexed to the kingdom of Serbia, placing it under the rule of the rival Karađorđević dynasty. Final, to complete the transfer of power and sever all ties with the old regime, the council ordered that all assets of the deposed royal family would be confiscated by the state. And just like that, with a single vote in a room full of Serbian soldiers, a kingdom that had maintained its independence for centuries, a nation that had joined the Allies as a sovereign equal, was wiped off the map not by an enemy, but by its greatest ally. When the news reached King Nicholas in France, he was devastated. He was consumed with rage, bordering on madness. This was not a unification. It was an annexation, a hostile annexation. He issued a series of desperate and furious statements. He called the Podgorica Council an illegal farce, a crime against international law, a violation of every treaty and every principle of justice. He appealed to the Allied leaders, whom he considered friends. He wrote to President Wilson of the United States invoking his famous 14 points and the principle of self-determination for all nations, great and small. He wrote to Prime Minister Lloyd George of Britain and Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, reminding them that his country was their first and most loyal ally, that his troops had died saving the Serbs. Is it possible, he wrote in a heartbreaking public appeal, that Montenegro, the first nation to draw its sword in the common cause, should be the only nation to be punished, and punished in this terrible way by losing its independence, its freedom, its state, and its dynasty? His protests were ignored. They were dismissed as the bitter words of a deposed dictator back in Montenegro. His loyal green supporters, seeing their king betrayed and their country robbed, decided to act. They were warriors, not politicians, and they reacted in the only way they knew how. On January 6, 1919, the same Orthodox Christmas Eve that had witnessed their heroic victory at Mojkovac 3 years earlier, the Christmas uprising erupted. Thousands of Greens, led by officers loyal to Tsar Nicholas, took up arms against the Serbian white government and the occupying Serbian army. It was a desperate, tragic rebellion. It was also a brutal civil war, brother against brother, tribe against tribe, in a bloody struggle for the soul of the nation. For weeks, brutal fighting raged across the mountains. The Serbian response was swift and brutal. They pursued the Green rebels with artillery and machine guns. They burned houses and confiscated the property of anyone suspected of sympathizing with the king. Those rebels who were captured were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The uprising was crushed in a wave of terror, leaving deep scars that would not heal in Montenegrin society for 100 years. This was the setting for the great event of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The leaders of the victorious Allies Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, gathered at the Palace of Versailles to build a new world, a world safe for democracy. King Nicholas and his government in exile came to Paris believing that this was their court of appeal, where this terrible injustice would finally be overturned. They received polite and impenetrable indifference. King Nicholas, the 77-year-old king of an allied nation, was not seated at the table. His delegation was not recognized. He was essentially a ghost. The man who had reigned for nearly 60 years, the man who had fathered the Queen of Italy and had been an ally of the assassinated Russian Tsar, was now reduced to the humiliating status of a petty lobbyist. He and his ministers were forced to wait in the lobby and antechamber of the Quai d'Orsay, handing out leaflets and memoranda to any diplomat who wanted them, presenting their position against the annexation of the country. Most officials just shamefully walked past him. He was utterly defeated. Nikola Pasic and the Serbian delegation, who claimed to be the voice of all South Slavs, were the favorites of the conference. They presented the Podgorica Assembly as the democratic will of the Montenegrin people to form a new unified state together with their brothers. The Christmas uprising was dismissed as a minor internal disturbance, instigated by a few Austrian agents and malcontents loyal to the deposed king. The great powers, each for their own skeptical reasons, chose to accept this lie. France, which had been Montenegro's protector in the past, now placed its strategic interests in a single powerful Yugoslavia that could serve as a powerful ally in the Balkans and a bulwark against any future rise of Germany or Austria. King Nicholas was an inconvenient complication to this grand strategy. Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, had completely turned against him, Britain, while secretly showing some sympathy for the aging king, ultimately followed in France's footsteps. Lloyd George focused on Germany and the Middle East. The fate of a small Balkan kingdom was of little consequence. The United States, led by the idealist Woodrow Wilson, was perhaps the most tragic failure. Wilson had championed the rights of small nations, but he was easily swayed by the simplistic narrative that Pasic presented. Presented with a democratic assembly that had voted for union, what could he object to? He accepted fait accompli and approved the establishment of the new Yugoslav state. Nicholas's only real, albeit largely powerless, supporter was his son-in-law, the King of Italy. The Italian delegation strongly opposed annexation, but their motives were seen as selfish. Italy also had major territorial disputes with the new Yugoslav state over territory on the Adriatic coast. Their protests on behalf of Montenegro were dismissed as a calculated attempt to weaken their new rival. The betrayal was total. In the halls of Versailles, as the new map of Europe was being drawn, the Kingdom of Montenegro was officially erased altogether. It was annexed, along with Croatia and Slovenia, into the new Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. For King Nicholas, it was the end of everything. His life's work, the 58 years he had spent building his country, had been declared null and void. He had lost his throne. He had lost his kingdom. He had lost all his personal and ancestral property, all of it confiscated. Now officially, and in the eyes of the whole world, he was a king without a kingdom. The tragedy was real. His life's work was not just destroyed. It was declared an error, an aberration of history, to be corrected by the inevitable wave of South Slavic unification. Even his family, his last consolation, began to crumble under the unbearable weight of this new reality. Some of his children, seeing that the cause was hopeless, began to quietly make peace with the new regime in Belgrade, begging for forgiveness or the return of their property, a personal betrayal that eventually cut deep into the old king's bones. King Nicholas was nothing but a title, an empty, meaningless word. He was a king in name only, a ghost at the feast of the new Europe, a penniless refugee living off the dwindling generosity of his son-in-law, the King of Italy, and the cold mercy of the French government. The tragedy was over. All that remained for the aging warrior poet was death. The last years of King Nicholas I passed slowly, heartbreakingly, and without much honor until he faded into oblivion. Living penniless in exile in France, he spent his final days writing futile appeals to a world that had abandoned him. He was a faceless political entity, a ghost of a bygone era. He died on March 1st, 1921, not of illness, but of a broken heart, tormented by a profound sense of betrayal. He was not given a state funeral or a burial in his homeland. Instead, his body was flown back to Italy and interred in a modest crypt in the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in San Remo, an unusual tomb for a king without a kingdom. For nearly 7 decades, his legacy was systematically erased. Within the new kingdom of Yugoslavia, he was officially branded a traitor. Montenegro's history was rewritten. The 1918 annexation was presented as a happy unification, and his name was suppressed. But a legacy can lie dormant, like a seed. For 68 years, he lay in that strange grave. Then in 1989, as Yugoslavia began to disintegrate, the remains of King Nicholas and Queen Milena were brought to Cetinje tens of thousands of Montenegrins who had lived their entire lives feeling like traitors, lined the streets, weeping openly. It was a funeral 68 years later, a national apology, a reawakening of a long-suppressed identity. So, who is he? He's not a simple hero or villain. He's a dictator, and he's stubborn. But not a traitor. The historical consensus is clear. He was a loyal ally who was brutally betrayed. And the Podgorica Council was an illegal annexation carried out under foreign military occupation. But his final justification wasn't written in 1989. It was written in 2006. That year, the Montenegrin people held a democratic referendum and voted to restore their independence. The republic was reborn. The king's core ambition, an independent, sovereign Montenegrin state, was finally achieved, 85 years after his lonely death. The story of Tsar Nicholas I is a painful reminder that history is often written by the victors. In the brutal reckoning of 1918, he was the loser. His kingdom was wiped out, his name blackened, and his body buried in a foreign land. But history has a long memory. He died in exile, devastated, his career seemingly in tatters. Yet his eventual victory after his death proved that the legacy of independence, however tarnished or forgotten, can endure. His story is not only the story of a forgotten king, but also the story of a kingdom that refuses to be forgotten.